The morning Henrietta Garner told Elias Brooks she would not marry him, not now, not until she was good and ready, and she did not know when that would be. He stood in the doorway of her father's dry goods store in Caldwell, Kansas, with his hat pressed to his chest and his dark eyes steady as the horizon, and he said simply, "Then I will wait." She had expected anger. She had expected the kind of wounded pride that sent men stomping off into the dust, or the kind of wounded dignity that turned tender courtship cold and distant. She had seen both before, in men who courted her sister Clara and in men who had attempted, briefly, to court her. What she had not expected was the calm, certain quality of those three words, spoken in a voice as low and unhurried as the sound of the Arkansas River when the summer heat slowed everything to a crawl. She had not expected him to mean it. But Elias Brooks was not a man who said things he did not mean. The year was 1878, and Caldwell, Kansas sat just north of the Indian Territory line like a man leaning over a fence to peer at something dangerous and beautiful on the other side. It was a cattle town in the truest sense, a place where the Kishom Trail funneled thousands of longhorns, and the men who drove them through the wide main street every summer, filling the saloons with money and noise, and the occasional gunshot that nobody discussed at church the following Sunday. It was a town that was always arriving and never quite arriving, always building itself up and burning parts of itself down, always one season away from becoming something permanent. Henrietta Garner had grown up in it. She knew every plank of the boardwalk, every smell of cattle and sawdust and cheap tobacco, every face that mattered and every face that was just passing through. She was 22 years old in the summer of 1878. With dark auburn hair she pinned firmly under a bonnet when she worked and let fall in long waves when she was alone in her room at night, reading by candlelight. She had green eyes that people sometimes called sharp, and she preferred to think of as careful. She had opinions that she kept mostly to herself, except when she did not, and when she did not, they came out with a precision that made people uncomfortable and then, eventually, respectful. Her father, George Garner, ran the dry goods store on the corner of Main Street and 2nd Avenue. He was a quiet man, her father, the kind of man who listened twice as much as he spoke, which was exactly the opposite of most men Henrietta knew. Her mother, Margaret, had died of fever when Henrietta was 14, and her sister Clara was 11, and the three of them had arranged themselves into a life that functioned without much sentiment and a great deal of practical love. Clara had married 2 years ago, a cattleman named Harold Fitch who was dull as a butter knife but steady as a fence post, and had moved 40 miles north to a ranch near Wichita. Henrietta remained in Caldwell, keeping the store accounts, watching the trail hands come and go, and reading everything she could find, which in Caldwell was not nearly enough. Elias Brooks had come to Caldwell in the spring of 1878. He was 26, lean and broad-shouldered in the way of men who worked hard outdoors, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something stubborn and dark eyes that surprised people by being warm when they expected them to be cold. He was a ranch hand who had worked his way up from a cattle drive out of Texas to a foreman's position on the Holiday Ranch outside of town, a spread of good grassland and decent cattle owned by old Thomas Holiday, who was 64 and increasingly content to let someone else manage the daily details. Elias was not flashy. He did not drink to excess, did not gamble more than he could afford to lose, did not make noise about himself. He showed up to work before anyone else and left after everyone else, and within 2 months Thomas Holiday trusted him with the accounts, the hands, the horses, and the keys to everything that mattered. He had come into the dry goods store on a Tuesday in April to purchase coffee, rope, and harness oil, and Henrietta had been the one to fill his order because her father was in the back taking inventory. He had been polite and direct, paid without argument, and thanked her by name, which surprised her because she had not introduced herself. She asked how he knew her name. He said everyone in town knew George Garner's daughter ran the store accounts, and that he had heard she could calculate a column of figures faster than a man could write them down. She had looked at him with the careful eyes. He had looked back without flinching. He came back the following Tuesday for more coffee and rope, and the Tuesday after that for coffee and something else she could not now remember, and by the fourth Tuesday she understood that the Holiday Ranch had a very specific and remarkable requirement for coffee and rope that no other establishment in Caldwell could apparently satisfy. She had not been flattered exactly. She had been interested, which was rarer and more dangerous. He had asked her to a church social in May. She had gone. He had asked her to ride out to see the cottonwood grove along Bluff Creek in June, and she had asked her father's permission, and her father had said nothing for a long moment, and then said that Elias Brooks seemed like a man who knew what he was about, which from George Garner was approximately equivalent to a sermon in praise. The ride along Bluff Creek had been one of those evenings that felt like it existed slightly outside of ordinary time, the air full of cottonwood seed drifting like snow in July, the creek running low and gold in the evening light, Elias talking about the land in a way that showed he loved it without being sentimental about it. Henrietta had found herself talking more than she usually did, about her mother, about the books she read, about the way Caldwell was changing, and the way she was not sure she wanted it to change, about things she had not said aloud to anyone. By August, everyone in Caldwell understood that Elias Brooks was courting Henrietta Garner. By September, the women at the church social were already measuring the likely size of her wedding dress in their minds. And then, on the first cool morning of October, when the cottonwood leaves had gone gold and the last of the trail herds had pushed through, and the town was settling into its quieter winter self, Elias had come to the store. He had asked George Garner respectfully and directly for permission to propose to Henrietta. George Garner had said that was a question better put to Henrietta herself, which Elias had accepted with a nod. And then he had asked her quietly in the back of the store among the bolts of calico and the barrels of dried beans, with his hat pressed to his chest and his voice steady. She had said no. Not no to him exactly. No to the timing. No to the expectation. She had said, "Elias, I think very well of you. I think more of you than I have thought of any man. But I am not ready to be married, and I will not be hurried into it by the calendar or by what anyone in this town is thinking, and I cannot tell you when I will be ready, only that when I am I will know it." He had looked at her for a long moment with those dark, warm eyes. Then he had said, "Then I will wait." She had told him that was not a reasonable position to take, that she could not ask that of him, that it was unfair to both of them. He had said he was not taking the position because it was reasonable, and that he was not taking it because she had asked. He was taking it because it was what he chose, and he was capable of choosing his own course. She had told him he might wait a very long time. He had said he understood that. She had told him he ought to go find a woman who was ready and not waste his time. He had smiled just slightly and said he did not experience being in her company as a waste of anything. He had put his hat on, wished her a good afternoon, and ridden back to the Holiday Ranch. And so it began. The winter of 1878 settled over Caldwell with a cold that cracked the mud of the street into hard ridges and kept most people indoors more than they wanted to be. Elias came to the store on Tuesdays as he always had. He was no different in his manner toward Henrietta than he had been before he proposed, and she declined. He was friendly, direct, respectful. He did not press. He did not sulk. He did not make her feel guilty with meaningful silences or pointed glances. He spoke to her father about cattle prices and weather and the quality of the winter hay. He spoke to Henrietta about whatever she wanted to speak about, and when she asked about his work, he answered fully and with interest. And when he asked about her reading, she was pleased to find he had actually read 2 of the same books, both of which had made their way to Caldwell by routes she could not entirely account for. One evening in December, a particularly fierce norther having driven the temperature well below what any human being could consider acceptable, Elias arrived at the store just before closing to find that the iron stove pipe had come loose from the ceiling joint and was filling the back room with smoke. Henrietta was up on a crate attempting to reattach it with a pair of tongs while her father, who had a bad shoulder that winter, watched with anxious helplessness. Elias, without comment or fanfare, took off his coat, rolled up his sleeves, found a proper wrench among the tools in the back, climbed up, and fixed the pipe in about 12 minutes. Then he climbed down, rolled his sleeves back, put his coat on, and said he had better get back before the trail to the ranch became impassable. Henrietta watched him go and then stood for a moment in the back room with the smoke clearing and the stove pipe fixed, and a feeling in her chest that she was not prepared to name. She did not name it. She filed it carefully away and went to help her father close up the store. Christmas came and went. Clara and Harold came down from their ranch near Wichita for 3 days, and Clara spent a substantial portion of those 3 days asking Henrietta about Elias Brooks in the indirect way Clara had of asking direct questions. Henrietta gave her indirect answers that were designed to be unsatisfying, and Clara gave her a long look that only sisters can give, which communicated without words that Clara thought Henrietta was being stubborn, and Henrietta communicated back, also without words, that she did not disagree with that assessment and did not particularly care. The new year turned to 1879. Spring came back to Caldwell with the particular enthusiasm of a season that knows it has been missed, and with it came the first cattle drives of the year, and with those came all the noise and commerce and occasional chaos that defined the town's working character. Elias had spent the winter building a small addition onto the bunkhouse at the Holiday Ranch, something he had drawn up himself and executed with the help of 2 of the ranch hands. And old Thomas Holiday was so pleased with the result that he had begun talking about building a proper foreman's house on the property, a small but real house with a kitchen and a front porch, something a man could actually live in rather than simply sleep in. Henrietta heard about this from her father, who heard about it from Thomas Holiday himself when the old man came in for his monthly supply order. She thought about what it meant that Elias was building himself a more permanent place at the Holiday Ranch, and then she thought about why she was thinking about what it meant, and she set both thoughts aside firmly and went back to her accounts. In May of 1879, a man named Gerald Paxton came to Caldwell from back east somewhere, one of those places where men wore their shirts too stiff and their ideas too certain. He was a land speculator, which in 1879 Kansas meant he was a man with a particular kind of energy that alternated between charm and pressure. He was perhaps 30, with light eyes and a handsome enough face, and the conversational fluency of someone who had practiced it. He began coming into the dry goods store, as a great many men did, and then he began staying to talk, as fewer men did, and then he began directing his conversation specifically at Henrietta, which was his right, and he was not rude about it. Henrietta was not interested in Gerald Paxton. She found his charm slightly mechanical and his certainty exhausting. But she was a woman who had been told she would be waiting for herself to feel ready, and she had been conducting a private internal examination of what that readiness was supposed to feel like, and she was scientific enough in her thinking to consider the question from multiple angles. She allowed Gerald Paxton to take her to the church social in June because she believed in being thorough in her assessments. Elias Brooks had also been invited to the church social, as he usually was. Henrietta watched him across the churchyard, talking to Thomas Holiday and a couple of the other ranchers, and she noticed that he saw her arrive with Gerald Paxton. She noticed that his expression did not change in the way she had half expected it to change, the tightening of the jaw, the studied indifference. His expression simply remained what it was, which was pleasant and easy, and he tipped his hat to her across the yard the same way he always did, and then he went back to his conversation. This bothered her considerably more than it would have if he had looked jealous. Gerald Paxton was attentive and amusing company for approximately 2 hours, after which his conversation had exhausted itself, and he began repeating his better remarks with the confidence of a man who had not noticed he was repeating them. On the walk home, he told her she was the most interesting woman he had encountered in Caldwell, which she found she could not take as a compliment since she did not know how he defined interesting, and suspected he defined it as pretty enough to pursue. She thanked him politely and went inside and sat in the parlor for a long time in the dark, thinking. She had spent an evening with a man who was available and unattached and moderately interesting, and who clearly wanted to court her, and she had felt precisely nothing of significance. She had walked across a churchyard and seen a man talking about cattle and hay prices, and she had felt something she had been not naming for 8 months. She was not ready to call it what it was, but she was beginning to recognize its outline. The summer of 1879 was a difficult one in Caldwell. The heat came early and stayed cruel, drying the grassland to a pale gold that made every rancher nervous, and in July a fire broke out on the eastern edge of town, taking 3 buildings before it was contained. No one was killed, but the Larson family lost everything they had and were staying in the church while the community figured out how to help them. Henrietta organized a collection of goods from the store, donated a significant portion herself, and spent 3 days helping Mrs. Larson sort through donated items and establish what the family needed most urgently. It was hard, practical work, the kind she was good at. Elias rode in from the holiday ranch on the 2nd day of the effort, when she was knee-deep in donated goods in the church hall, and without asking what needed doing, he simply began to do the things that needed doing. He moved boxes, repaired a broken chair that had been donated in a condition that was charitable to call rustic, rode out, and came back 2 hours later with a load of lumber from the ranch that Thomas Holliday had contributed. He and Henrietta worked side by side for most of that afternoon, and in the particular focused way of people engaged in necessary work, they talked more freely than they usually did, because neither of them was thinking about the situation between them. They were thinking about the Larsons. He told her about his own family, things he had not said before. His father had been a rancher in Texas who lost the spread to debt when Elias was 17. His mother had died 2 years before that of a fever much like the one that had taken Henrietta's mother. He had 2 brothers, both younger, both still in Texas working other men's cattle. He had left Texas at 20 with the intention of finding land that was his own, and Caldwell had been one of a series of stops that had lasted longer than he expected, because the land around it was genuinely good, and Thomas Holliday was genuinely fair. Henrietta told him about her mother in more detail than she had before. She told him what it had been like to be 14 and suddenly the older woman in a household with a grieving father and a young sister, and how she had learned the store accounts because someone had to, and her father could not look at them for 2 months after the death. She told him she had grown up in a space between girl and woman very quickly and had never entirely gone back, and that sometimes she wondered what she would have been like if she had been allowed to take the transition more slowly. He listened the way he always listened, which was entirely. "I think you would have been exactly who you are," he said. "Some people grow into themselves no matter what." She looked at him across a pile of donated quilts. He was dusty from the lumber and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was nothing careful or considered about the moment. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was going to have to be honest with herself very soon. That she could not keep filing things away indefinitely. That the careful cabinet where she stored unnamed feelings was developing a pressure problem. But she was not ready, or she told herself she was not ready, and the difference between those 2 things was beginning to feel complicated. Gerald Paxton left Caldwell in August of 1879, his land speculation having yielded unclear results. He said goodbye to Henrietta in the store with a graciousness that she found she genuinely respected, and she wished him well and meant it. That chapter, such as it was, closed cleanly. The autumn of 1879 brought Thomas Holliday's announcement that he was building the foreman's house. He hired a carpenter from Wichita and 2 local men, and the construction began in September on a gentle rise about a quarter-mile from the main ranch house, with a view of the grassland that on clear days showed a horizon so wide and open it felt like a fact about the world rather than a feature of the landscape. Elias had designed it with the carpenter, and Henrietta heard about the details from her father, who heard about them from Thomas Holliday, who seemed to find the whole enterprise deeply satisfying. A front porch facing south, a kitchen with proper ventilation, 2 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms. She was aware with some irritation at herself that she had been counting the bedrooms. November arrived, and with it the 1-year mark from Elias' proposal. Henrietta noticed this privately, on a Tuesday when Elias came in for his order, and their conversation was no different from any other conversation they had had. She noticed that he did not mention it, did not reference it by look or tone or any of the subtle instruments men used to remind women of what they had declined. He simply spoke to her about the weather, about a horse that Thomas Holliday had purchased at Wichita, about a book he had recently acquired through the mail order, a collection of essays about land management that he thought might be useful, but that also contained, unexpectedly, a section of poetry that he found he did not mind. She asked which poet. He said his name was Whitman and that the writing was unusual, nothing like hymns, more like the sound of someone thinking out loud about the country they were standing in. She said she had heard of him, had never read him, and that she would be interested to see the book if he was willing to lend it. He brought it the following Tuesday. She read it over 2 weeks, in the evenings by candlelight, and found that it did something to her that she could not quite articulate, something about the directness of it, the sense of a person being utterly present in the world they inhabited. She found herself thinking about Elias reading the same words. She found herself wondering what he had thought of specific passages. She found herself writing small notes in the margins, in pencil, lightly, things she wanted to say about what she was reading, and then she realized that the person she was writing these notes for was him. She returned the book. He took it and thanked her. He did not look at the notes until he was back at the ranch, where he sat on the front porch of the new foreman's house in the January cold with a blanket across his knees and read every penciled word twice. He sat for a long time after that, looking at the dark grass under the winter stars, feeling something that was not impatience and not despair but something quiet and settled and certain. He could wait. He had said he could wait, and he found that what he had said was true, which was the most important kind of truth. January of 1880 brought a harder winter than the last. The temperature dropped with a viciousness that cracked the water troughs at the Holiday Ranch and froze the pipes in the dry goods store, and Henrietta's father developed a cough in February that did not leave him. The doctor, a competent man named Albright who had his limitations, said it was a chest ailment and recommended rest and warmth, and something for the cough that he dispensed from a brown bottle that smelled of camphor. George Garner was not the kind of man to rest easily, but the cough had a convincing authority that he could not argue with, and Henrietta took over the full management of the store with a completeness that left her tired in the evenings in a way she had not been before. Elias noticed. He did not say anything direct about it for several weeks, because Henrietta had a particular quality of self-sufficiency that he had learned to respect rather than override. But in March, when she was at the store alone on a Thursday, which was not his usual day, he came in and said plainly that he had some free time and would like to help if she would tell him what needed doing. She had looked at him for a moment with an expression that was more transparent than she intended, something that was tired and grateful and slightly unguarded, and then she had said there were 2 heavy crates in the back that needed moving, and the account ledger had 3 weeks of entries that she had not caught up on because she did not have the evenings for it. He moved the crates. He sat down with the ledger and said, "Talk me through your system," and she did, and he was faster at it than she expected, and they finished the backlog in 2 hours. He stayed for supper, her father joining them at the table looking somewhat better than he had in weeks and clearly pleased to have company. The meal was simple, beans and cornbread and dried apple, and the conversation was easy and unhurried, and Henrietta refilled Elias' coffee twice without thinking about it, and her father watched this with quiet attention and said nothing at all. Her father recovered slowly through the spring, and the cough eased but did not entirely leave, and the doctor said he was mending, but that he was not 25 and should not conduct himself as if he were. Henrietta managed the store and learned the winter accounts and discovered several inefficiencies in her father's ordering system that she corrected, and the store ran better for it, which her father acknowledged with a pride that was completely genuine even if his vanity required him to note that he had been intending to make those same corrections himself. In April of 1880, Clara came down from Wichita with news. She was expecting her first child in the summer. She was radiant with it and terrified with it in equal proportion, and she needed her sister and her father and 3 days of being in the house where she had grown up. Henrietta was so glad to see her that she let Clara spend an entire afternoon asking questions about Elias Brooks without deflecting any of them, a level of conversational generosity she had never previously extended. Clara asked why she had not said yes yet. Henrietta said she was not ready. Clara asked what ready meant. Henrietta was quiet for a moment and then said honestly that she was not entirely sure, which was more honest than she had been about it with anyone, including herself. "Do you love him?" Clara asked. Henrietta looked at her sister for a long time. "Yes," she said, with the flat certainty of a woman who has known something for a while and is only now saying it aloud for the first time. "Then what are you waiting for?" "I'm waiting for it to feel like the right time. I'm waiting to feel like I'm not being married at because that's what happens next. I'm waiting to know that I'm choosing it, not being moved along by the current into it." Clara looked at her with the older sister's eyes that had somehow transferred themselves to the younger sister. "Henrietta, the current has been offering you the choice for a year and a half. Elias Brooks is not the current. He's the man standing on the bank who keeps offering you his hand and then putting it back in his pocket when you look away." Henrietta did not answer that, but she thought about it for a long time after Clara went to bed, sitting in the parlor in the dark the way she did when she was thinking about something important. Summer came. Clara's son was born in June, a healthy boy they named George after his grandfather, and the news made the elder George Garner so happy that his cough improved markedly for a week. Henrietta rode up to Wichita with a neighbor family who were traveling that way and spent 2 weeks helping Clara with the new baby, sleeping in the small back bedroom of the Fitch Ranch house, and learning the exact combination of rhythm and patience that George Jr. required before he would sleep. She loved the baby with an immediate, uncomplicated love that she found surprising. She had not expected to feel this particular warmth quite so quickly, this sense of a small person who had arrived and who was simply and completely real. She thought about children. She thought about them in the context she was honest enough with herself to think about them in, which was not an abstract future but a specific possibility, and the specific possibility had a specific face. She came back to Caldwell at the end of July in a different state of mind than she had left in, not entirely sure how to describe the difference except that something had shifted or settled or become clearer, the way a landscape looks different after rain. August of 1880. 18 months since the proposal. A Tuesday in August, the heat at its most confident and the store busy with the early fall provisioning that the trail herd's departure triggered. Elias came in at his usual time, bought his coffee and his supplies, spoke to her father who was doing better and was back behind the counter, and then said to Henrietta casually that the foreman's house was finished now, properly finished, and that Thomas Holliday had thrown a small celebration of the fact the previous weekend, and that the house sat very nicely on its rise with a porch that caught the south wind beautifully. He said this without any secondary meaning that she could identify. He said it the way he said most things, directly and without decoration. She said she was glad to hear it. He nodded and put his hat on and left. She stood behind the counter looking at the door for what her father, diplomatically, did not measure with any observable attention. September came. Henrietta made a decision. The decision was not about Elias specifically, or rather it was not only about Elias. It was about herself, about what she wanted and what she was afraid of, and why those two things had been so difficult to separate. She had been afraid, she admitted to herself in the clarity of a September morning, of the losing of herself. She had watched the women around her become wives and then become the wives, had watched how the definition contracted, how the person inside the role got smaller as the role got more total. She had seen her own sister, who was bright and strong, spend most of the past 2 years talking about Harold Fitch's cattle instead of about herself, and she had understood that Clara was not diminished, but that she was contained, that her life had a shape now that was largely defined by another person's enterprise. What she had not fully accounted for was the specificity of Elias Brooks. He was not a man who wanted to contain things. He had spent 18 months demonstrating, without explicitly demonstrating it, that he was interested in what she was interested in, that he listened when she spoke, that he did not expect her silence or her agreement, that he was not building a house with 2 bedrooms because he wanted a housekeeper in a particular location. He was building a house with 2 bedrooms because he was a man who thought about the future in terms of what kind of life he wanted to be living in it, and the life he wanted had space in it. She had been testing him, she realized. Not quite deliberately, but not quite accidentally either. She had been watching for 18 months to see whether the patience was real or whether it was a strategy, whether the warmth was genuine or whether it was a performance calculated to wear down her resistance. And what she had found, over 18 months of Tuesdays and church socials and hard winters and a ledger book and a borrowed book of poetry with penciled notes in the margins, was that it was entirely real. He was exactly who he appeared to be, which was something so uncommon that she had spent a year and a half disbelieving it. She thought about what Clara had said. The man on the bank with his hand extended. She decided she was going to stop making him wait. Not because she had to. Not because the time had passed or the pressure had built or anyone had told her she should. Because she was ready. Because she had done the long, honest work of figuring out what ready meant and she had arrived at it on her own terms, which was exactly what she had said she needed. The timing was hers. It had always been hers. That was what she had been protecting, and she had protected it, and now it was time. She said nothing to anyone about this. She thought about how she wanted to do it. She thought about it for 3 days, which was enough thinking. On a Wednesday, not a Tuesday, which she thought with private humor showed that she was not entirely predictable. She told her father she needed to step out for an hour or 2 and that she would be back before the afternoon rush. She saddled the mare she kept at the livery, the small bay she had ridden for 4 years, and she rode out to the holiday ranch along the trail she knew well by now, through the late September grassland that had gone gold and dry and beautiful in the way that always made her think of something she could not name. She found Elias in the corral beside the barn, working with a young horse that was still being broken to saddle. He saw her coming and held the horse still with one hand on the halter and watched her approach with an expression she could not read from a distance and could read very clearly when she was close enough. It was surprised and very careful, the expression of a man who has learned not to assume. She dismounted and tied the bay to the fence post. "I was not expecting you," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to ask you something." He waited. "You told me a year and a half ago that you would wait until I was ready. I want to know if that is still what you want or if something has changed for you." He looked at her for a long moment. "Nothing has changed for me." "All right," she said. "Then I am telling you that I am ready. If you are still asking, then my answer is yes." The September air sat between them, warm and faintly smelling of grass and horse and the particular dry sweetness of the Kansas plains in fall. Elias released the young horse into the corral and came to stand at the fence, very close to her. His expression had done something she had not seen it do before, which was lose its careful quality entirely, so that what was underneath was simply visible. "Are you sure?" he said, not ready in the sense of being willing, but ready in the sense you meant when you said it. "Yes," she said. "I know the difference." He was quiet for a moment longer, and she understood that he was taking the time to accept something he had not been certain he would ever receive. Then he said, with a straightforwardness that was completely characteristic of him, and that she found she loved quite specifically, "Then I would very much like to marry you, Henrietta Garner." "Yes," she said again. "I know." He smiled then, and it was not the small, slight smile she usually saw from him, but the whole of it, and it changed his face in a way that made her breath catch. And she thought that she had been looking at that face for 18 months and had never seen this particular version of it, the one with all the careful patience finally released. She reached across the fence and he took her hand, and they stood like that for a long moment in the September light, the young horse moving around the corral behind him and the grassland extending in every direction under a sky so blue it seemed like a statement. "You should come speak to my father," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "Today I would like to stand here for a few minutes." She laughed, which was not something she did often and therefore meant something when she did, a genuine, surprised sound. "All right," she said. "A few minutes." He came to speak to her father the next morning. George Garner listened to him with the full attention he gave everything, and then he looked at his daughter, who was standing slightly behind Elias, and she met his eyes and gave him the smallest nod, the one that meant "This is my choice," made freely, with full knowledge. George Garner extended his hand to Elias and said, "I have thought of you as a good man since April of 1878, and I find I have not been wrong." And that was that. They were married in the first week of November 1880, in the church in Caldwell on a morning that had gone cold but clear, the kind of clear where the light came in sideways and gold and made everything look like it was being described in a story. Clara came down from Wichita with Harold and baby George, who was by now 5 months old and had opinions about everything. The congregation was the same congregation that had spent 2 years taking private bets on when and whether this event would occur, and they watched it with the proprietary satisfaction of people who feel they have been part of something. Henrietta wore a dress of deep blue wool, not white, because she was a woman who made her own decisions, and she had decided that blue suited her better than white, and that the occasion was hers, and she would dress it the way she saw fit. Elias wore his best suit, which was dark and clean and fit him as though someone had taken particular care with it, which it turned out his friend and fellow ranch hand, a man named Pete Holloway, had done, pressing the thing with a hot iron the night before, and declaring with characteristic ranch hand ceremony that it was good enough for a governor. When the minister asked if she would take him, she said yes with the same flat certainty she had said it across the fence of the horse corral, the yes of a woman who had done the work of knowing and was now stating the result. When the minister asked if he would take her, Elias said yes in the quiet, steady voice that she had first heard say, "I will wait," and that she would hear every day for the rest of her life, and that would always carry the particular weight of a man who meant exactly what he said. They were married. The congregation had opinions and suppressed most of them for the duration of the service, then released them all at once in the yard afterward, so that the sound of Caldwell's collective reaction to the union of Henrietta Garner and Elias Brooks emerged as a general warm noise that seemed to please everyone, including, in their quieter way, the people at the center of it. They rode out to the Holiday Ranch in the afternoon, because that was where the foreman's house was, the house with 2 bedrooms and the south-facing porch, and Thomas Holliday had very diplomatically absented himself to have supper with a neighboring rancher, leaving the main ranch house to Pete Holloway and the Hands, and leaving the foreman's house entirely alone on its rise. Henrietta stood on the front porch in the late afternoon light and looked at the grass and the horizon. The view was exactly as she had imagined it from the descriptions she had accumulated over many months, wide and open and very still, the kind of view that settled something in a person, that reminded them where they were and gave them a sense of being exactly placed. Elias stood behind her and then beside her. They stood in silence for a while, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind they had always been good at. 2 bedrooms, she said. Yes, he said. You planned ahead. I had a reasonable expectation of needing space. Very reasonable, she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that was different from the careful warmth she usually kept in reserve, a warmth that had been let out from wherever she had been keeping it. She turned to look at him, in the last of the November light with the cold coming on and the grass going dark and the porch under their feet solid and real, and she said, Elias. Yes, he said. I'm glad I made you wait, she said. And I'm glad you did. He looked at her with the whole of his face still available, the way it had been in the corral, nothing held back. So am I, he said, every part of it. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her, and they watched the night come in across the Kansas grassland, the first stars appearing one at a time above the western horizon, and the cold settling gently around them, and neither of them in any particular hurry, because they had learned, both of them, that the worthwhile things arrived when they were ready and not before. The winter of 1880 into 1881 was the first winter of their life together, and it was a winter they would talk about for years afterward, not because anything dramatic occurred, but because of the ordinary quality of it, the dailiness that revealed itself to be extraordinary in the accumulation. Elias rose before dawn and did his work, and Henrietta made the ride into Caldwell 4 mornings a week to manage the store accounts, her father's health having settled into a plateau of managed limitation that allowed him to keep his hand in the business while she kept the essential machinery running. She came home to the foreman's house in the afternoons, and in the evenings they ate together and talked about their days with the frankness of 2 people who had decided that the inside of their life together would not be a formal place. He told her about the cattle, the difficulties, and the small victories. She told him about the store, the customers, the particular human dramas that a general merchant saw in cross-section, all of life coming through the door eventually in need of flour or nails or rope or something for a cough. She told him about the books she was reading, a package of 3 novels having arrived from a bookseller in Kansas City, whom she had found through a newspaper advertisement, and with whom she had established a correspondence that would become one of the small pleasures of her life for years. He told her about things he observed in the land, the way the grass grew in different patterns on different soils, the way weather moved across the plains with a logic that could be read if you knew the language of it. They read by the fire in the evenings. Sometimes the same book passed back and forth, sometimes different books, occasionally allowed to each other, and the house that had been built for this purpose settled around them with the particular satisfaction of a space that is being properly used. She was happy, Henrietta Garner, who had become Henrietta Brooks, though she kept Garner in her own accounting of herself, the way women in 1880 Kansas did not especially do, and Elias had never suggested otherwise. She was happy in the specific way that she had wanted to be happy, which was the kind that had room in it, that did not require her to be smaller than she was, that felt like a choice reaffirmed daily rather than a status passively occupied. In March of 1881, she realized she was expecting a child. She told Elias on a Tuesday evening, because she had come to have a private affection for Tuesdays, and his response was to sit down in the kitchen chair and look at the table for a long moment with an expression she had never seen before on any person, which was the expression of a man receiving news so significant that his body needs a moment to accommodate it. Then he looked up at her and said, with a quietness that was full to the edge, "That is the best thing anyone has told me." "Don't go to pieces," she said, though her voice was not steady and they both knew it. "I am not going to pieces," he said. "I am sitting down because it seemed appropriate." She sat down across from him, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table in the lamplight. And they were both laughing and not quite laughing simultaneously, the way people do when something real arrives, and the appropriate response is not a single feeling but many feelings all at once. The summer brought her father out to the foreman's house more often, the ride not being beyond him on a good day, and he would sit on the south porch in the sun and talk to his son-in-law about cattle and weather and the prospects for the coming season, and Henrietta would bring them coffee and then sit with them, contributing to the conversation as the mood took her, which was frequently. George Garner had decided, in the way of fathers who have spent years watching their children make sense of the world, that his elder daughter had arranged her life with remarkable precision, and that Elias Brooks was either the most patient man in Caldwell County or a man who had simply understood something that took others longer to see. He thought it was probably both. Clara came down in August to help with the preparations, organizing and opinionating in her natural style, and the two sisters spent several days in a state of happy, affectionate bickering that was the language of their closeness, arguing about the relative merits of various preparations with the seriousness that only sisters can bring to cheerfully unimportant debates. The baby arrived in October of 1881, a boy, born at the foreman's house with the doctor and a neighbor woman in attendance and Elias in the front room wearing a path in the floorboards until the door opened and Dr. Albright came out and said it had gone well and he could come in now. The boy was healthy and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's particular expression of watchful intelligence, which he demonstrated within his first hour of life, with a surveying quality that made Henrietta laugh and wince simultaneously. They named him William George Brooks, William for no one in particular except that it was a solid name, and George for a grandfather who sat on the south porch the following afternoon and held his first grandchild in his arms with a careful tenderness that Henrietta stored in the permanent record of things she would not forget. Life on the Holliday Ranch continued. Thomas Holliday, in the later months of 1881, confided to Elias that he was thinking about his future, meaning the future of the ranch, meaning specifically what would happen to it when he was gone. He had no children and no close family, and his instincts ran toward permanence and continuation rather than sale and dispersal. He had watched Elias manage the ranch for 3.5 years with a quality of attention and care that he privately thought was rarer than the man himself understood. He had watched Elias and Henrietta together on the property with the particular pleasure of a man who has a high opinion of both individuals, and is pleased to find that the combined result exceeds the sum of the parts. He began to talk about a long-term arrangement, the kind that would give Elias a stake in the ranch itself over time. These conversations happened slowly and carefully, the way significant things did, and they were not resolved in 1881, but the shape of what they were building toward became clear enough that Elias told Henrietta about them, in the way he told her about everything that mattered, which was completely. She listened carefully and asked precise questions and thought about it for 3 days, and then said what she thought, which was that Thomas Holliday was a fair man making a fair offer, and that the details mattered but the principle was sound. He agreed with her assessment and said so, and they continued the conversation with Thomas Holliday together in due course, because Henrietta had a clarity about arrangements that both men recognized as valuable. The year 1882 brought changes to Caldwell the way it brought changes to all the cattle towns along the Kishom Trail, which was to say, with the relentlessness of progress that did not consult anyone about its intentions. The railroad had been extending its reach, and the patterns of the cattle trade were shifting as the railheads moved, and the economics of the long drive from Texas became less compelling. Caldwell would continue to function and grow, but the particular wild fever of the Peak Trail years was beginning its slow subsidence, and the town was in the early stages of figuring out what it wanted to be next, a process that involved considerable disagreement and several loud meetings at the courthouse that Henrietta attended, because she had opinions about the direction of the town's commerce and was no longer as inclined as she had once been to keep them to herself. Elias attended one of these meetings with her, and was amused and proud in equal measure at the efficiency with which she dismantled a particularly specious argument from a newcomer businessman named Aldrich, who had apparently not encountered a woman who argued from numbers before. The look on Aldrich's face when he realized the numbers were not going to cooperate with his position was, Elias said later, something he would treasure. "You looked like you were enjoying yourself considerably," he said. "I was," she said, without particular apology. He laughed in the full, easy way he had around her, which was different from the way he laughed around other people, more released. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "The world is not ready for that," she said, and there was an edge to it that was not quite bitterness and not quite humor but somewhere in between, the honest acknowledgement of a limitation of her time. He heard all three layers of what she said, as he always did, and nodded once in the way that meant "I see that," and his expression was something she had come to know as the particular serious warmth he had for the things about her world that he could not fix but could at least refuse to pretend were not there. William grew. He was a busy, serious child, the kind who collected information the way other children collected toys, always asking what and why, always watching. Henrietta taught him to read before he was 5 in the evenings by the lamp, with the patience of a woman who found the process genuinely interesting rather than merely dutiful. Elias took him around the ranch in the mornings when he was old enough to be in a saddle, teaching him the names of things, the way the cattle moved, the smell of weather coming. The boy absorbed all of it with the watchful quality he had been born with, saying little, remembering everything. In the spring of 1883, the negotiations with Thomas Holliday reached their conclusion. The arrangement was formalized with the help of a lawyer from Wichita. Elias would purchase the ranch over 15 years at terms that reflected both its fair value and Holliday's wish that it go to someone who would work it well. Thomas Holliday would retain use of the main house for the remainder of his life, and Elias and Henrietta would take on the full management and financial responsibility of the operation. It was, by any measurement, a significant thing, and they signed the papers at the lawyer's office in Wichita with William sitting between them on the office chair, which was too big for him, swinging his legs and asking the lawyer questions about the books on his shelves. Riding back to Caldwell, Elias was quiet for a long stretch of the road, looking at the grassland with an expression she recognized as the one he had when something real had settled on him, and he was accepting the weight of it. "It's a great deal of responsibility," she said. "Yes," he said. "Are you worried?" He thought about it. "No," he said, "not worried, aware. There's a difference." "Yes," he looked at her. "You'll be part of it. The decisions, the accounts, all of it. I'm not doing this alone." "I know," she said. "I signed the papers, too." He reached across and took her hand for a moment, there on the road in the May sunshine with William asleep in the back of the wagon, and it was a gesture so simple and so complete that it required nothing added to it. George Garner's health declined slowly but with an unmistakable direction through 1883. The cough that had started in 1880 had never fully resolved, and by autumn of 1883 it had a new quality of depth and persistence that Dr. Albright called a lung ailment and that Henrietta understood, with the quiet intelligence of a woman who read and observed and put things together, was a serious diminishment. She increased her visits to Caldwell, riding in 5 days a week, and sometimes staying the night in her old room above the store when the weather made the return impractical. She managed the store with the same efficiency she had always managed it, and she sat with her father in the evenings and they talked about everything and nothing, about the store and the past, and William and Clara's growing family, and the state of the country, and the books she was reading, all the conversations of a life winding toward its completion. Elias handled the additional load at the ranch without complaint, managing with one fewer hand than he would have liked and doing it with the same straightforward competence he brought to every difficulty. He visited George Garner himself when he could, on Sundays usually, and the older man's face always brightened at these visits, not because he was performing brightness, but because he genuinely liked his son-in-law. And in the way of men who know their time is limited, he had simplified his affections to the ones that were real. George Garner died in February of 1884, quietly, in the night, in the bed he had slept in for 20 years, in the room above the store he had built from a single-room storefront to the most reliable establishment in Caldwell. Henrietta found him in the morning and sat with him for a while before she sent for anyone. She sat in the chair beside his bed and held his hand, and said the things that people say and that have no adequate words but that are said anyway because silence would be worse. And then she went and found Elias, who was waiting at the foot of the stairs because he had known something was wrong when she came in. The grief was real and clean, the grief of losing a parent after a long illness, which carries within it the complicated mixture of loss and something that is not relief but is adjacent to relief. The knowledge that suffering has ended, that the person you loved is no longer diminished. She cried in private and was dry-eyed in public, in the way of her nature, and Elias did not try to alter this in any direction, but was simply present in the particular way she needed, which was solidly and without requiring anything from her. They sold the dry goods store the following spring to a man named Carson, who seemed to understand what he was buying and handled the transfer with appropriate respect. Henrietta kept her father's accounts ledger, the first one he had used when he opened the store, and a small watercolor of the Kansas grassland that had hung in the parlor, painted by her mother before she died. She kept nothing else from the store itself, which she thought her father would have approved of, because he had always been more interested in the functioning of things than in the sentiment attached to them. The ranch filled her life with a completeness that surprised her. She had not expected to find herself genuinely interested in the operation of the property, but she was, in the same way she was interested in everything that made logical sense and could be understood through observation and good accounting. She tracked the books with the rigor she had brought to the store and identified 2 areas in the cattle operation where the margins could be improved, one by adjusting the timing of sale relative to the seasonal price patterns, and one by renegotiating a supply arrangement for winter feed that had been running on terms that were generous to the supplier, and less so to the holiday account. Elias implemented both changes, and the difference at the end of the first year was significant enough that he showed her the year-end figures and said, with a smile, that he thought they had made a good partnership. "I have always thought so," she said. "You have not always been willing to say so." "I was in the process of verifying," she said. "And now?" "Verified," she said, and the word carried enough warmth in her voice that it was something more than what it said. Thomas Holliday died peacefully in the summer of 1885 in the main house, surrounded by no one because he had outlived his friends and his family, but with the full management of everything he had built in capable hands, which was what he had wanted. He had told Elias the previous year, on a Sunday afternoon on the main house porch, that he considered the arrangement the best decision of his later life, and that he had watched Elias and Henrietta together and thought they were the kind of people who would do well by the land and by each other, and that both mattered to him equally. Elias had thanked him in the direct, ungarnished way that Thomas Holliday had always appreciated about him, and they had sat in comfortable silence for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. The ranch became formally theirs that summer, the Brooks Ranch, though some of the older hands still called it Holliday's out of habit for years. Elias expanded the operation carefully, adding cattle but not more than the land could carry, hiring hands with the same attention to character that Thomas Holliday had used. Henrietta managed the household and the accounts and her correspondence and her reading and her son, and she remained exactly herself while also being exactly in her life, which was the thing she had spent so long protecting the possibility of. William was 4 years old now, and the question of his education was one that Henrietta was thinking about with an increasing seriousness. Caldwell had a school, which was adequate for what it was, but adequate was not the word Henrietta liked in relation to her son's mind. She wrote to a correspondence school program in Kansas City that she had read about, and received a detailed reply, and talked to Elias about it at length, and they decided together that William would attend the Caldwell school for his primary years, and that they would supplement it with everything they could manage themselves, which was considerable. In the spring of 1886, the second pregnancy. Another boy, born in the November of that year, healthy and loud in his first arrival where William had been watchful, a child who announced himself from the first breath with a confidence that made the doctor laugh. They named him Robert James Brooks, James for the poet whose collected works had been on Elias' shelf since before they were married. Robert was a different person from William from the very first days, sunny and forward, and interested in the social dimensions of any situation, where William was absorbed in the mechanisms. Elias said, watching his younger son in his first weeks, that they had been given two completely different people who were somehow made of the same materials. "That is how families work," Henrietta said. "How would you know?" he asked. "You have a sister. Clara and I are nothing alike," she said. "You are entirely alike," he said. "You are alike in every important way. You just use different methods." She considered this. "That is probably the most perceptive thing you have ever said." "I have my moments," he said. William took his new brother's arrival with a seriousness appropriate to an eldest child, inspecting the baby with the focused assessment of someone cataloging a new specimen, and then declaring that Robert had a good face, which was William's highest available compliment at age 4, and which Henrietta preserved in her private memory as one of the great moments of her life. The years built themselves. The ranch prospered with the slow, incremental quality of things that are properly managed over time. The cattle herd grew to a size that required an additional foreman, a young man from Texas named David Carver, who had some of Elias' own qualities of competence and quiet reliability, and who fit himself into the operation with the good manners of someone who understood what he was joining. Henrietta liked him immediately and told Elias so, which Elias took as the endorsement it was, since Henrietta's assessment of people had proven over the years to be reliable in a way that suggested she was reading something others missed. William grew into a boy of 7 who read everything and asked questions that sometimes stopped adults in their conversational tracks, requiring them to think harder than they had expected to. Robert grew into a boy of 3 who was the most sociable creature on the Brooks Ranch and who could generally be found in the company of whoever was doing the most interesting thing at any given moment, following the ranch hands around the corrals and into the barn with a purposeful attachment that made the hands both fond of him and slightly careful about what they said. Henrietta continued her correspondence with the Kansas City bookseller, whose name was Mrs. Abernathy, and who had become, through 4 years of careful letters about books, a genuine intellectual companionship of the kind that the geography of the frontier made difficult to find in person. They exchanged opinions, recommendations, and occasionally sharp disagreements about specific books with the honesty of two people who respected each other's minds. Elias read the letters when they arrived and was always interested in Henrietta's responses, and occasionally she read him passages from Mrs. Abernathy's letters that she found particularly worthwhile, and his responses to these were good enough that she once told him he would have been a fine correspondent himself if he were not so occupied with cattle. "Tell Mrs. Abernathy I agree with her about the Tolstoy," he said. "You haven't read the Tolstoy," she said. "I've listened to you read it. That counts." "It absolutely does not count," she said, but she told Mrs. Abernathy anyway in a postscript, and Mrs. Abernathy's reply said that she found this charming and that it counted for at least half. Clara visited in the summer of 1887, with Harold and their 2 children, young George, now 6, and a new little girl they had named Margaret after their mother, a toddling creature of enormous charm and strong opinions. The house on the ranch was full for a week in the particular loud, overlapping way of family visits, and Henrietta found herself looking at her sister across the dinner table one evening, in the lamplight, with all 4 children somewhere between awake and asleep, and the 2 husbands in conversation at the end of the table, and feeling the kind of gratitude that does not need to be said because it is too large for saying. Clara caught her looking and raised an eyebrow. Henrietta raised one back. Clara mouthed the words "I told you so" with the exaggerated dignity of a woman who has been waiting 9 years to deploy 3 words with maximum effect. Henrietta shook her head, but she was smiling, the full, genuine, surprised smile that Elias could always produce in her without apparent effort, and that Clara had apparently been cultivating the conditions for without telling anyone. In the quiet of a late evening in 1887, when the children were asleep and Clara and Harold had retired, and Elias and Henrietta were sitting on the south porch in the summer dark, she told him something she had not told him before. She said that she wanted him to know, since they were on the other side of things now and she could see it in perspective, that she had been frightened, not of him specifically, of the way that love could become the thing that defined you instead of one of the things that was true about you. She had seen it in women she respected, the narrowing, and she had been afraid of it. He listened with the full attention he gave everything she said. "And now," he asked. "Now I know that the fear was not wrong," she said. "Only that it was not the whole picture. The narrowing happens when the person you are with is not genuinely interested in what you are. When what they want is the wife shape, not the actual person." "Yes," he said. "You were always interested in the actual person," she said. "I knew that. I think I knew it from the first year, but knowing something intellectually and trusting it enough to build a life on it are different things." "They are," he agreed. "The 2 years were mine," she said. "I needed them, not because of anything wrong with you, because I needed to know my own mind." He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand in the dark. "I know," he said. "I always knew that. That's why I waited." She turned her hand in his. "You never doubted that I would get there." He was quiet for a moment. "I doubted sometimes," he said, with the honesty that was one of his fundamental characteristics. "Not whether you were the person I wanted, but whether you would arrive at the same conclusion. Those are different doubts." "Yes," she said. "But even when I doubted, I knew that if I had been wrong, if you had arrived at a different conclusion, that would have been a real conclusion and a real choice, and I would have had to accept it." He paused. "It would have been the hardest thing I ever faced. But it would have been yours to make." She sat with that for a while. The night was warm and the stars were very clear, and the ranch spread out in the dark around them, the corrals and the barn and the grassland extending to a horizon she could not see but knew was there. "I am very glad," she said quietly, "that I made the choice I made." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her fingers, a gesture that was entirely private and entirely for her, and said, "So am I." They sat on the south porch for a long time in the summer dark, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, the horses moving in the corrals, the particular silence of the grassland that was not actually silence at all, but a composition of small sounds that added up to peace, the kind of peace that you can only inhabit when you have done the work of arriving at it honestly. The following years unfolded with the rhythm of a life properly rooted. William entered his formal school years with an appetite for learning that both confirmed everything his parents had suspected and revealed dimensions of his mind they had not anticipated. A particular talent for mathematics that emerged at age 8, and by age 10 had outpaced everything Caldwell School could teach him on the subject. Henrietta wrote to the correspondence school in Kansas City and arranged supplementary materials, and Elias spent Sunday afternoons working through the problems with his son with a seriousness that William clearly found deeply satisfying. The two of them bent over the kitchen table with papers covered in numbers. Robert, 3 years younger, was less interested in numbers and more interested in people and horses. He was the child who remembered everyone's name and everyone's preferences, and appeared at the ranch hand's breakfast table most mornings with the air of someone who has specific social intentions for the day. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's jaw, and the social instinct of neither of them, which suggested that some things are their own. In 1889, Henrietta organized the women of the Caldwell area into what she called, with deliberate plainness, a reading group. This was in practice somewhat more than a reading group. It was a meeting of women who had things to say, and through the framing of books, a venue in which to say them. The group met at the Brooks Ranch once a month, in the main front room, and the conversations that unfolded were wide-ranging and often illuminating, and occasionally heated in the way of intelligent people, engaging with ideas that mattered to them. Elias, on these evenings, made himself useful elsewhere on the property and left the house to its purpose, which Henrietta privately appreciated and publicly never mentioned. The ranch continued to grow. David Carver, the young foreman from Texas, had become indispensable by 1890, the kind of man who understood the operation as deeply as Elias himself and who managed the day-to-day with the same quietness. It was not surprising to anyone who watched carefully when, in the summer of 1890, Carver began making regular Sunday trips into Caldwell that had nothing to do with supplies, and it was not surprising to Henrietta, who noticed such things, that the trips coincided with a particular family named Whitmore who had a daughter of 20 named Anna. She said nothing to Elias for 6 weeks and then said, one evening, "David Carver is in love with Anna Whitmore." Elias looked up from his reading. "I know," he said. "How long have you known?" 2 months. "You didn't tell me. I thought you'd figured it out before me and were waiting to see if I'd notice." She looked at him. "That is uncomfortably accurate." He smiled and went back to his reading. "Are you going to do anything about it?" "No," she said. "It's not mine to do anything about. I just like knowing." Anna Whitmore and David Carver were married in the spring of 1891, in the same church in Caldwell where Elias and Henrietta had been married a decade before, and Henrietta attended with an appreciation for the occasion that was personal and particular, and that she expressed to no one except Clara, in a letter, that said she found she had a great deal of sympathy for young love navigating itself to its conclusion, and that watching it arrive where it was going was one of the more quietly satisfying experiences available. Clara's response said, "You say young love as if you have forgotten being it yourself. You have not, I think. You have simply decided to be dignified about it." Henrietta reread this letter twice and then wrote back, "Dignity is underrated." To which Clara replied, "Not by you, it isn't." William turned 10 in 1891, and Elias and Henrietta began the long conversation about his future education, the kind of conversation that was not resolved in a single evening or even a season, but unfolded over time with the deliberateness they brought to all important things. There were schools in Wichita and Kansas City that could offer what Caldwell could not. There was a cost to this in money and in distance, and they examined both with the same care. William consulted directly because both his parents believed in consulting him, said he would go wherever there was more to learn, and said this with a calm certainty that reminded Henrietta, with a precision that made her breath catch, of someone saying, "I will wait," with the same quality of settled intention. She told Elias this later in the dark of their room. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "He'll be all right." "I know he will," she said. "He has your quality of knowing what he wants." "And your quality of figuring out how to get it," Elias said. "We have done reasonably well with that combination ourselves," she said. "Yes," he said, "we have." The year 1892 brought a drought to the Kansas grassland that ranchers in the region would reference for decades afterward, a dry summer that turned the grass pale and brittle and reduced the creek water to a thin thread, and that required every calculation about water and feed and the timing of cattle sale to be made with extra precision. Elias and Henrietta worked through the drought year with the focus of people who have built something they are not willing to lose. The decisions were good ones, made together with the account books open on the kitchen table and the land maps spread across the parlor floor, and the ranch came through the drought diminished but intact, which was more than could be said for several other operations in the county. Some of their neighbors were not so fortunate, and the community response to those losses was another exercise in the practical charity of frontier life, a gathering of the still standing to help the fallen down. By 1893, with good rains having returned and the grass coming back with its usual resilience, the Brooks Ranch was recovering its full operation and then exceeding what it had been before the drought, because the difficult year had forced efficiencies and clarities that turned out to be improvements. David Carver managed the east section with a competence that allowed Elias to think more broadly about the overall direction, which was becoming increasingly the style of a man who has built something solid enough to plan its future. He and Henrietta spent several evenings that winter with maps and figures, talking about what the next decade might look like, what they wanted to leave when they were done. "Not done for a long time," he said. "No," she agreed, "but it doesn't hurt to think forward." "What do you want it to look like?" he asked her, genuinely the way he always asked things. She thought about it carefully. "I want it to be the kind of place that a person can make something real in," she said. "Not just profitable. Real. I want William and Robert to be able to choose it if they want to choose it. Not to feel obligated to choose it, but to find it worth choosing." "That's a good way to put it," he said. "I want the books to balance," she added. "Obviously," he said. "And I want that south porch to need repainting every few years because we use it constantly." He looked at her across the table with the full warmth of his face that she still found, after 13 years of marriage, to be something she was not accustomed to but never tired of. "I can guarantee that," he said. Spring came to the Kansas grassland in 1894, with a generosity that felt like an apology for the drought years, all the color and movement that the land was capable of producing coming back, with a certainty that made even the most pragmatic of ranchers go quiet for a moment and simply look. The grass came in thick and green, and the wildflowers spread across the lower pastures in swaths of color, and the creek ran clear and full, and the morning air had the particular quality of a beginning. Elias rode the fence lines in the early morning as he always did, checking, observing, attending to the land with the quality of attention that had made him the man Thomas Holliday had trusted with his life's work. He came back to the house when the sun was fully up and Henrietta was in the kitchen, and he leaned against the doorframe and watched her for a moment without speaking, the way he sometimes did, taking in the ordinary miracle of her moving through their kitchen in the morning light. She knew he was there. She always knew when he was there, a fact about herself that she had long since stopped finding surprising. "The east pasture fence needs work at the north corner," she said. "I know," he said. "I've already told David." "Good." He came in and poured his coffee and sat at the table, and she brought her own cup and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a while in the comfortable way of two people who have inhabited the same space long enough that silence between them is its own kind of speech. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. "Do you remember what you said to me when I told you I wasn't ready?" He looked at her across the table in the morning light of 1894, 16 years removed from that October morning in the dry goods store. "I said I would wait," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." Was it the right thing to say? She considered it with the full seriousness she gave to real questions. "It was the right thing to mean," she said. "The saying was one thing. The meaning of it was everything." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen in a horse corral in September of 1880 when the careful patience had finally been let go, and what was underneath it had become entirely visible. It was still the same expression. It had not changed in 14 years of marriage and 2 sons and 1 drought and 1 ranch, and all the Tuesdays and Sundays and evenings on the south porch, and arguments and agreements and books passed back and forth, and accounts managed, and a father lost and children raised, and a life built with the same quality of attention one gives to things that matter. I would wait again, he said. Every day of it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, the Kansas morning was doing what it did, the light coming across the grassland in long gold lines, the horses moving in the corral, the sound of the boys waking up somewhere in the house, William's deliberate footsteps and Robert's quicker, less careful ones. The south porch needed a coat of paint again. The accounts were balanced. The grass was green. The creek was running. "I know," she said. "That is the thing I love most about you." He turned his hand under hers and held it. And there they were, Elias and Henrietta Brooks, on a spring morning in Kansas, in the kitchen of the house that had been built for them both, in the life they had arrived at by the slow and honest route, together in the particular completeness of people who have done the difficult work of knowing themselves and each other and have found, after everything, that the work was worth it. William came thundering down the stairs and burst into the kitchen in the purposeful way of a 12-year-old boy, with a specific mathematical question he had been considering since before dawn. Robert followed at a run, already engaged in a conversation with himself about something that had occurred to him in the night. The house filled with the noise of their family, which was its proper state, and Henrietta got up to pour more coffee and Elias got up to help with breakfast, and they moved around each other in the kitchen with the grace of long practice, and the morning went forward. Outside, the grassland ran to its horizon under the wide Kansas sky. The ranch spread across the land that was theirs now, that they had signed for and worked for and planned for, and would leave better than they found it. The south porch faced the south wind. The cottonwood along the creek that she had ridden with him in the June of 1878 was still standing, taller now, and in the summer it would shed its white seed again in the still air, drifting like something almost too gentle for the particular country it inhabited. Henrietta Garner Brooks, who had said she would marry when she was ready and not before, and who had meant it, stood in her kitchen on a spring morning in 1894 with coffee in her hand, and her sons making noise at the table and her husband crossing the room to stand beside her, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be, which was the only place she had ever agreed to be. She was ready. She had been ready for 14 years. And it had been, from the very first Tuesday when a man with dark eyes came in for coffee and rope, exactly the right time,